buildings that were 400 feet away from the nearest tower. It hurled debris, and like this is like 400 feet up in the tower, just explosively hurled in all directions. Steel pieces being blown as far as 500 feet radially, all directions from the towers. Demolition squibs are features seen in controlled demolitions where puffs of dust suddenly emerge from the facade. And these are seen clearly in the North Tower. They're much more apparent when you watch a video, and these squibs just instantly pop out of the building with velocities of maybe 100 feet per second. They just shoot out of the building by 100 feet. And they're well below the area of complete destruction. So these couldn't possibly be caused by floors falling down and squeezing out air, because if that's the case, then what's generating all this pulverized concrete up here? The floors are the only concrete element in these buildings. And yet you have these high velocity gas ejections occurring as much as 20 stories below the zone where the whole building is just breaking up. The way I describe what happened to the towers is that they were, I don't think you can get around calling these explosions. They exploded into these clouds of dust with steel hurling in all directions. And these explosions became over 500 feet in diameter by the time they reached the ground. Actually more like 800 feet in diameter. But the reason I think people don't think of them as explosions is because they occurred over a period of 15 seconds in either case. So there wasn't a particularly, like, normally people think of an explosion as you hear a loud crack, a bang, and then it's just that one event. But if you have, in the case of a demolition where you might have thousands of explosions that are all blending in, then you get one huge explosive event, but you don't hear any distinct explosions that's so much above the roar of it. The thing sounded like, sort of like an ocean wave, just this incredibly loud roar. But incredibly explosive. The tops, I described them as mushrooming because they blew out so far. This is the North Tower, and this distance here is about 120 feet. The tower is 207 feet across the face. So and this is only a few seconds into the collapse, and this stuff is being hurled out with a lot of lateral energy to be thrown that far out. And they mushroom, and this cloud just becomes larger and larger as it goes straight down to the ground. The symmetry is probably the most telling element. I spoke a little bit about that earlier, in that they followed the vertical axis of the building. The destruction followed the axis of the building in both cases all the way down. Even in the case of the South Tower, where the top had started to lean for 2 seconds, and then it just disintegrated and just went all straight down to the ground. Hurling debris in all directions. The steel skeleton was shattered and thrown for distances up to 500 feet. FEMA itself illustrated the fallout pattern. So again, I emphasize that natural phenomena follow the path of least resistance, not the path of maximum resistance. So this is not possibly a natural event, that the tower is just falling down. It's being systematically destroyed. That's the only explanation for the symmetry. Each tower disappeared into a volcano-like cloud of dust. I mean, the comparison of these events to volcanoes is very telling. It was like, when these towers came down, the dust was so thick that it was pitch black on the streets. And the clouds are thick too. Hanschel talks about this photographer talks about being picked up and carried a block by the dust. It was so thick. And the dust was apparently had the 90,000 tons of concrete in each tower just pulverized into dust so fine that it stayed suspended in the air for a few minutes. So the non-metallic objects in the towers were pulverized to fine dust, including the bodies of people, which 1,000 of which were never even recovered, even though they were looking at little tiny dust samples and using advanced DNA techniques. But the only recognizable objects at ground zero were pieces of metal that aren't so easily destroyed. There was just shards of metal, as if the buildings were just shredded. They were just shredded, and the dust was inches deep, as far as blocks away from ground zero. That's what happened. The people, the gypsum, the concrete, it was all in this dust all over the Manhattan. So very few pieces of steel were longer than 30 feet. It made it very convenient for the cleanup operation. They could load it on trucks without cutting it up. And there was this intense heat that persisted for over 100 days. Ground zero smoldered into December because there was so much residual heat. So all those are features of controlled demolition, maybe features that are beyond controlled demolition in terms of the excess heat, in terms of the degree of pulverization. But that's all the more evidence that these were controlled demolitions, because to get an event that's even more destructive, you need to put even more energy into the explosives, presumably, that pulverize these buildings. Now the final section is to actually break it down into proofs. Here's an argument that shows, here's a series of arguments that actually shows that demolition is the only plausible explanation. The first one is just to look at the pulverization of the concrete. What you see in the case of both buildings is this intense pulverization, this white clouds of concrete. These are clouds of concrete and gypsum. And by the distribution, by the opacity of these clouds as they're being ejected, by the distribution of mass around these buildings, I mean, they didn't just fall straight down on the footprints, they radiated out all over the place, and probably just a small fraction of the mass was within the actual footprints of the buildings. And especially the concrete, which is just all over the streets. Apparently, virtually all the concrete in these buildings was thoroughly pulverized. There's 4-inch thick concrete floor slabs on every floor in the 110 floors of each of these towers, and there's no evidence of any macroscopic chunks of concrete at ground zero. I mean, you can scour the images, and all you see is dust and chunks of steel. So this is entirely counterintuitive, because if you were to take a concrete block and drop it from, say, the roof of the tower, I'm sure it would smash into a lot of small pieces, but it wouldn't turn into microscopic powder, where the particles are less than 100 microns in diameter. But you need a lot of, explosive energy applied consistently throughout the building to achieve that. This proof, I think, is the one that I think most people get. And this has to do with looking at the way the building came down and the rate at which it came down, but specifically at which the rates of different parts of the rubble came down. So if you were to drop a brick off the roof of the tower in a vacuum, it would take 9.2 seconds to reach the ground. The towers came down completely in 13 to 16 seconds. So by 16 seconds, everything is down. So that's only about 50% longer than gravitational free fall. And that's true of all the stuff that's falling through the air. So the only thing that's slowing down all this stuff outside the profile of the building is air. So the air is slowing things down by, say, 30 to 50 to 60%. But if you look at the inside of the profile of the building, everything's coming down in here, too, at the same rate. Well, but wait a minute. This is falling freely through the air, and it's 100 feet out from the building. It's been falling for a long time. It's falling freely through the air, and even big chunks of steel are falling, at this rate, being slowed down only by air. But here, inside the building, remember, all this mass of the building is supposedly crushing itself, but yet it's coming down at the same rate as the rubble falling through the air. So the non sequitur here is, to believe the official story, you have to believe that all this intact, cold, incredibly strong steel structure that was so strong it can hold this building up in a horizontal crosswind of 100 miles an hour, 150 miles an hour, and yet the building is providing all that steel structure is providing no more resistance to falling rubble than air is. So it's it's just ludicrous to think that the steel structure would just be crumbling, just self-destructing. That's what it would have to be. It would have to be a self-destructing building. There's another proof that's much more complicated. It has to do with just looking at the energy requirements needed to expand the dust clouds. Because if you look at, there's photographs that show the development of these dust clouds, and this one is 30 seconds after the start of the North Tower collapse. And I do a precise estimate, or not that precise, but I look at the at reference points in the dust cloud, and make an estimate. And this cloud by 30 seconds is about 5 times the volume of the building. And there's 2 main ways that can happen. One is that the turbulence can increase the size of the dust cloud, but to the extent that can't, then all the rest of the expansion has to be provided thermally, by thermal energy evaporating moisture and by just causing thermodynamic expansion.